Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Right. We should just have a listening music with Daniel party. I think that would be quite fun. Welcome to the Stoa, everyone. The Digital Porch, 3rd edition. So I imagine most people are aware of the format. This is sort of an open session. So unlike the other Sensemaker in Residence series, there's no prepared topic or PowerPoint or anything like that. We're just going to sit on the digital porch and ask Daniel Schmachtenberger, who's the Sensemaker in Residence for this day and this month, questions. And Daniel and I decided, I mentioned this in my mailing list, our mailing newsletter last night, that we're going to just have the broad attractor of personal development and personal practice during the meta crisis or the transition between game A, game B, and this crazy time that we're in. So we're going to stay away from more abstract things like the war on sense making or system building and stuff like that. So that being said, some of you not that many people actually sent the questions in the survey, but I might pick on you if you or choose you, I should say, if you asked a question. But feel free to drop your questions in the chat now. Maybe have a question or cue before it. If you don't want to be on YouTube, just say read on your behalf and I will do so. That being said, I will allow everyone to unmute themselves. Daniel, how's it going, my friend?
Good to see you, Peter. I appreciated your last article that you shared right before this on reality tunnel switching.
Right. Anything come alive for you when you read it?
How to navigate the interface of many very different reality tunnels, like you were discussing a kind of particular Christian approach to thinking about hell and demons and saints, and then come back to something like philosophy of science and logical positivism and say, what the fuck do I make of that? Is a very interesting and tricky topic. It's been so I don't know if that's a direction we'll go down at all, but it was valuable to at least have you acknowledge that gaining the first person experience of a way of experiencing reality is possible without being obligately bound to it forever. And then you can step out of it and do something with it.
So since I got first question rights, I will take us down there. And some people did ask questions related to kind of like evil. So I'll read a portion of the question. Is it necessary for us altogether to confront evil on a cultural level? I don't mean just the evil within ourselves, but also collectively acknowledge the shadow of psychopathy within the collective conscious. And I'm curious about this as I've been writing about kind of like demonic possessions and stuff like that. And I am curious about what your thoughts are on what evil is as a phenomenon or a construct. Do you think it exists? It doesn't exist? And if you do think it exists or something like it exists, how should we personally and collectively respond to it?
I'm very curious to start that one with a sampling from people here of how they hold the concept and reality of evil.
How would you like them to indicate that on the chats?
Or talk.
Anybody wants to maybe say something, just kind of indicate in the chats. I think we should avoid popcorn style for this one. Someone said that shit exists. Tyson Flows, if you can unmute yourself.
Sure, thanks. First thing that came up for me was like something is in like an entity, an energy, a person that wished to take advantage of me or like my insecurities or weaknesses or something to like create suffering in a way that would further its own interests and agenda. Yeah, and then the visual that came with it was like energies I've experienced specifically like in dreams, that it was like I was sleeping and I was in my bed and I was like in this like totally like vulnerable state, and like um and I encountered this entity in a dream, and it's like, oh, you're coming after me like while I'm sleeping. And I was like, that was kind of felt like an encounter with something that was like the closest thing to evil maybe I've experienced.
Yeah.
Peter, can I pop in because I'm the one that asked the question?
Sure.
Where I was coming from was looking at how we as individuals talk to each other and encourage each other to do shadow work. But there's a part of me that feels like despite our best intentions, and if we all do our shadow work, there's still going to be malevolent people and like institutionalized systemic psychopathy that will always take advantage, so that basically it's like a feeling that there's not much we can do that's really going to have any impact on that force.
I get that sense. Maybe since it was your question, I'll say something. I by no means am an expert in theodicy. I have friends that are scholars that have spent their whole kind of thinking career on the nature of evil from lots of different reality tunnels. So I'm just sharing some rough senses that I have of it. As soon as we realized that humans really got creative with torture techniques and tried to perfect the amount of subjective suffering that other humans can go through, we realized that there's something more fucked up than just kind of effective utilitarian game theory. There's something more fucked up going on there in the reality of not just psychopathy, but sadism, right? The actual positive experience associated with the negative experience of another. Then when we use a term like evil as opposed to a term like, say, malevolence or sadism, it engenders a metaphysical sense of are there demons or entities or a dark side of the force or a devil or some kind of like, is there a foundational ontology of evil other than just it being distortions in the psyches and bodies and brains of people? And, you know, there's more religious versions of that, like a devil or polytheistic or animistic kind of demons ideas or hungry ghost realms or things. And then there's kind of more new age science versions like morphogenetic fields, Sheldrake's work. Maybe there's morphogenetic field of certain kind of self-propagating destructive tendencies. I'm not close to the idea that there is some ontic reality outside of our belief or perception of it about those things, but I have no good reason to believe there is. More, I have pretty good reason that when people believe there is, it is usually an easy place for those people to get messed up. I have found some people who take seriously the idea of demons and devils and whatever, and some good comes of it, but it's very easy to go down directions that I would consider net not positive from that belief, which is different than saying from that as a symbolic psychological process. I think it can be quite valuable if it's held as a symbolic psychological process. So you're on a heavy dose of mushrooms doing a mushroom journey, and you see some demons coming after you. And it's possible, see, like even the cognitive frame of how to hold that, if someone holds it as the mushrooms are helping them see into the astral realms and the demons are actually there and they have to like protect themselves from the demons in that realm because there's some reality to it. I have seen people become traumatized from journeys in that way because now they're scared of what's happening in the astral realm. They're scared to go to sleep. They need protection with them, things like that. If you hold, these are phenomena arising in my experience, arising in my mind and my phenomenology, and that can't actually hurt me. Something arising in my mind can't actually hurt my other part of my mind or my body. The fear of it maybe can. So I go towards it as opposed to go away from it. The same would be, say, in a dream. We talked about this some last time. And, I had this experience when I first turned towards the demons, and they were going to come eat me. And I'm like, this is a fucking dream. This is a trip. Great, eat me. Like, I can't actually die here. Go ahead. And so then the fear dissolved because it couldn't actually really hurt me. And I'm like, please eat me. And then, so it tried to become something scarier, some nasty, like cockroach monster that was going to eat my eyes out. And there was a moment of fear, and I'm like, no, go for it. And so then that fear kind of dissolved. So then it became like a black hole that was going to swallow up the universe. I'm like, go for it. And then it was like a devil that was going to eat my soul. I'm like, go for it. And then it all just turned into light, right? Because there was no more fear. There was nothing that was going to get me to go into reaction with another part of myself in that way. So that was relating to demons in a symbolic way that created psychological integration of parts of self. I think that can be very helpful. In terms of the psychology of sadism, what makes people, like the psychology of sociopathy or psychopathy is one thing. How does someone have their empathy decoupled from other people, where someone else can be feeling something and they don't feel anything? But then how does someone get to the place where it's flipped, right? Where they actually feel positive emotional valence on somebody else's negative emotional state? I wrestled to understand this because I couldn't really access that experience very much in myself. And I still don't know that I understand it competently or fully, but I have some insights. Some people who, when they were young, suffered at the hands of other people a lot, felt controlled, felt like they were in suffering, and felt very alone in that. When they go on the other side and induce someone else to be in that state, there's something like connection that occurs. Someone else has experienced what they experienced. I have witnessed that as one of the phenomena. Also, where someone had a profound lack of control and they felt a lot of uncertainty and fear and insecurity, and the answer was gain control. Sometimes people who are sadists really actually will take joy in bringing other people excitement and bringing them hope, and bringing them sexual arousal, and then also crushing them and then bringing them back. Because it's not just an anti-coupling that they're happy when the other person is miserable. It's that they're happy when they get to experience their own control over reality, in particular the subjective reality of somebody else. So those would both be examples of evil as a result of a compensation pattern for trauma, right? The thing that we would call evil or malevolence in people as a particular kind of trauma response. That's mostly how I hold it on an individual level. And then collectively, there are whole cultures that are basically autopoetic traumatizers, that are traumatizing people systemically, and then which is then conditioning people to propagate those traumas. And so then you start to say, like, okay, well, if it is autopoetic, there's almost like a being to it, right? Like, let's say we take capitalism. Capitalism is this autopoetic, self-propagating, self-evolving thing, right? Self-evolving, because it goes from barter to, some people wouldn't even call that capitalism yet, but the owning of capital, property, from barter to currency, to fiat currency, to fractional reserve fiat currency, to algorithmic high-speed trading on fractional reserve fiat currency. It's like an AI, it's evolving its algorithm for how it does that, right? So you're like, okay, who did that? Well, nobody did that. Take the person who figured out algo trading out of the world in history, and somebody else would have. And so you're like, there is some autopoetic, self-propagating thing that's happening there. Is there almost like a spirit of that thing, an entity of that thing? That's why I really love that article on Slate Star Codex, Meditations on Moloch, because he's describing the autopoetic property of arms races, and then kind of describing what the spirit of that thing seems like. And it is really tricky when you get the sense of like, okay, those who seem to do the bidding of the game of power, those who seem to do well at the game of power, get more power in the system, and in turn keep modifying the system to be better for people like them. Those who oppose the game of power, including the worst evils and injustices of it, are also opposing the people who are doing well at it. So then those people work to get rid of the other people. And so there is the self-reinforcing dynamic. And you're like, that's a very powerful collective intelligence. What the fuck do we do to keep that thing from just running to zenith, which is a paperclip maximizer? And this is, I mean, I think it was intuiting that after the, World War I and then World War II that led to Lord of the Rings and Star Wars as these great modern mythos, right? Of Sauron and the orcs, or the Death Star and the Empire, that were like this kind of seemingly undefeatable, self-propagating paperclip maximizer type thing. And how was it that a small rebel alliance or fellowship of a ring could actually do something about it? I think the energy of hopelessness that you mentioned is something that one needs to feel and not pretend that they don't feel. Otherwise, they'll kind of fragment inside. But then recognize, whoa, that hopelessness is actually an expression of the depth of desire for hope in me, which is a result of the depth of love and care in me. And let me reconnect to the love and care, and then reconnect to my sense of agency. My sense of agency is overwhelmed, so I care more than I feel like I can do anything. So how do I come back to the care? And then how do I look to grow or increase my agency in steps, rather than be able to say, okay, my agency's here. Here's this whole set of issues. I can't address all of them, so I'm just overwhelmed. Someone needs to take a more developmental approach to how to increase their agency with that. Because otherwise, I think one of the ways that evil gets to self-propagate is by causing overwhelm in those that would oppose it. Right? Or basically decreasing will or agency, except where it has sociopathic or sadistic expressions. Because typically anyone who has sociopathic or sadistic orientation towards power doesn't get overwhelmed and lose power, right? They keep seeking, how do I hold empowerment more? So of course, okay, two more things I'll say about it. When we ask what is choice, the whole question about will and determinism is like foundational existential question. But if we were to define choice as being anything that is worthy of calling choice, then it's distinct from just causation or summed up causation. Otherwise, there's no basis to call it choice. And then we say, what is a good choice? The fundamental question of ethics. We can say, to the degree there is a reality of choice, a good choice furthers the field of choice. It expands the phase space of the possibilities to keep choosing. So choice is reifying itself. Whereas a choice that debases the possibility for future choice is kind of self-terminating choice. So if I'm making a choice that decreases my own agency and sovereignty, we can say pretty straightforwardly, that's not a good choice. It ends up debasing the possibility for choice. If I make choices that decrease the agency of others, and that decreasing the phase space of choice for the whole, that's also then the next level of the question. A good choice increases the phase space of choice for the whole, which also means the possibility of choices that would suck. So you don't ever get an absolute law or binding on no choice that sucks without actually debasing choice itself. Maybe you guys will have Forrest on some time to speak about that. That's kind of the beginning of how he talks about choice, and then he defines evil as that which does not further, that which shuts down the possibility to further the reality of experience and choice. I have a rabbi friend who describes evil as always being the result of a breakdown in intimacy, and that I can't hurt somebody if I feel really connected to them. And if there is a sense of us as part of the web of life, if there's a sense of intimacy with each other in the world, evil can't really arise in that presence. So there basically disconnectedness, a breakdown in the authentic intimacy of reality, because there is authentic connectedness, becomes the niche in which evil can arise. Probably just opened up more questions than answered, but those are the first thoughts that come to mind.
All right. And Forrest Landry is coming to the Stoa on October 27th for those of you who are interested. What's it called? So Keith, you had a follow-up question.
So I had two sort of follow-ups. It's good to see you again. And so the first follow-up is, can you speak to the way cultures select for institutionalized sociopathy? And then the second one is, and I'm thinking about that in terms of the pushing to the margins of perception that you might see in media, where certain things are highlighted and certain things aren't, in a way that allows the culture to ignore things that might stop it or make it second guess itself. And then the second one is kind of related to that. How do you set up your personal empathy stack? Like, what emotionally valent content do you bring into your life intentionally to kind of relate to the world?
The first topic I've talked about on a lot of podcasts of how arms races work, and the cultures that do the more effectively game theoretic things get selected. So I won't say too much on that. I think one thing I'll say is, because you brought up media specifically, one very easy way to do, one of the easiest ways for a whole culture to buy into evil is to believe that it's righteous. And all you have to do to commit an act of evil and believe it's righteous is believe the other to be evil. And so it's easy to take other subjects who have subjective experience and put a label on all of them together that makes them an object and actually makes them a nasty, terrible object, right? They're terrorists. They're racists. They're whatever it is. And now I'm not actually relating to a being with feelings. I'm relating to some bad entity that needs stopped or hurt. Now, to the degree that I heard it, I'm actually doing a good thing. And so there's this TED Talk everybody should watch. It's called something like On Being Wrong. And it's this lady who wrote a book and did this whole analysis on people's psychological experience of being wrong. And in the beginning, she asked the question, what does it feel like to be wrong? And people say, well, it feels embarrassing and shameful and stupid. And she goes, no, that's what it feels like to find out you were wrong after the fact. But you were wrong for a while first. What did it feel like before you found out? Well, it usually felt like being right, because you were usually pretty certain that you were right. And in the same way, what does it feel like to do evil? Well, it usually feels like righteousness, right? That's the holy war. So in the name of, I'm sure my side is right and I'm sure their side is wrong, even though I haven't spent real time with them and can't empathize with them and only have straw man versions of them, I feel right in attacking them because I'm on the right side of history. So anything that otherizes in a way that disconnects our empathy, which breaks the intimacy, ends up making evil easy to propagate and be hidden. That's one thing I'd say. And on the second question, I can't empathize at the speed that I can take in information about the world digitally. They have different process rates. So if I'm with a person in front of me who's telling me about their illness or their loss of a family member or whatever it is, I can feel and grieve with them. And there's more of a binding because of scale of the information they're sharing and the emotional experience they're in. and I can kind of process it with them, where my empathy doesn't leave me so overwhelmed that my only opportunity is to shut down. But if I take in the war in Armenia and Azerbaijan for 5 seconds, as I move to the war on the India-Pakistan border, as I move to the increasing chance of war in the South Pacific Seas, as I move into starvation in Africa, as I move into what's happening in the Amazon and some new whales that went extinct, and there's no way I can fucking feel that, right? And so it actually starts to condition relating to information about others without feeling. It starts to make that a pattern, right? A pattern of dissociation, which is not very healthy. So there's partly, I would say, just reconnecting at human scale for enough percentage of the time is actually important. If I'm focused on what's happening with animal rights globally, I need a certain amount of time at the local animal shelter with real dogs, right? With like just actually connecting to be able to ground it. And if I'm moving through the news quickly, I need some times where I move not quickly, and I'm not just trying to info process, I'm trying to actually connect to the reality of it. That's one thing.
All right. Any follow-up questions, Keith?
I guess if I had a follow-up, I am kind of curious. I definitely feel, Daniel, what you're talking about with just the getting turned off emotionally by, like, I think anyone who's engaging with highly cognitive, trying to save the world kind of content's going to run into that barrier. And then it's like, okay, I guess like my initial thought is like, okay, well, maybe I'll just try to figure out like where my agency is, and then emotionally relate to the things that I actually have agency over. But then there's this question of like, is that fundamentally limiting I'm limiting my scope? And do I just like turn on world food maps and see everywhere that's starving, and then like try to reorient with this more objective overview? I don't know what you do. So I'm kind of curious how you break it down yourself.
This is a very crude example, but it's not worthless. Let's say you have an athletic goal that's very far from where you're currently at. So for fun, let's say you want to bench press 500 pounds. There's actually no amount of trying to bench press 500 pounds that will ever let you get it. You'll just hurt yourself, because your muscles can't actually develop in that direction without bench pressing 180 pounds and then 200 and then 220. And so you can keep tuning into it. You can keep watching the person who can for inspiration. You can keep being aware that it's a direction you're wanting to trend, but then you also have to come back to actually work at the edge of where your current capacity is, if you want to grow your capacity. Because if you just keep trying to bench press to 500, you can do that for years and never actually make any progress. There's a similar thing where most of your time having your study be associated with things you can do stuff about, so you also get closed feedback loops on, am I getting this right? Is it working, right? I get some empiricism, actually helps you understand it better and grow your agency, while having some attention on the bigger problems to know, of all the directions I could develop, what direction do I want to develop in? But they're, in the same way that you want to have a relationship between the cognitive knowledge and the feeling, you want to have a relationship between the cognitive knowledge of the big picture and the sense of what you can actually do about it agentically, and that there is a growth in your agency that could converge towards the things that you're studying. And it doesn't mean you have to know all the steps of how it converges. You actually have to let go of knowing that. But you have to have a sense that your agency is actually increasing from the nature of your endeavors.
Okay. So many good questions. Ryan, you're up next.
Hey, Daniel, thanks so much for being here. I've been really enjoying your work. And thanks, Peter, for having us. So yeah, just curious how you personally parse those things apart, how you personally avoid limbic hijacking in the ecosystem of media as it is today.
I don't avoid it. I would be lying if I said I could avoid it. It's like saying that I could smell pizza and avoid having a physiologic response, hunger response. Like I might choose not to eat it, but a response is going to occur, right? And because there is those molecules in the air have a real response, and the same is true with those bits on the screen. And so when I see the framing of whatever, right? Cops attack a bunch of protesters, and I see that thing, I'm like, I feel a fired up thing. So then the question is, how do I process that? Since I know that it has an effect, and since I know that it's all bias, I don't let myself share the piece or believe it or act on it before I do the rest of my sense making work, right? So I then go look to see, okay, is there another side to this story that's reporting a different way? And it usually limbically hijacks me the opposite. Oh, those cops came after these people, attacked them, and whatever. And I see like a nearly opposite limbic hijack. And so I can't say we'll have no bias. I can say we'll try to take more different biases that are in dialectic so that I'm not just controlled by some of them. So rather than say unbiased, I'd say bias corrected. So simply identifying whenever there is a view, whether it comes down to what is true or a value statement that is polarized, I want to make sure that I actually understand and have felt and could argue both sides of it well before I share anything or take a position. Sometimes it's not just two things in dialectic. Sometimes there's a few perspectives that are really different and trending. I call it the narrative landscape. So I want to understand the narrative landscape. Once I can kind of put myself in the position of how different people are seeing and feeling this, then I can kind of not just empathize with them, but also get some parallax beyond it.
All right. Let's go with Harry. Harry, you had a question.
Hey, Daniel. I just want to say I actually love listening to all your stuff, so this is really cool. My question is actually what you kind of finished on last time, which is something you're interested in around how do we create systems where we can best see where people at different developmental stages can develop at what rates. So my question is on the topic of that, how do we take into account the different stages? And I'm using the integral model here as we map out heading into game B. And do you have any insight into creating a methodology that takes each stage, whether it's the ethnocentric, egocentric, or the global centric stages into account to bring us collectively into the ability to hold that globalized empathy or perspective?
I actually think historically I'm bad at this. Have Zach Stein come on and talk about it. He knows this much better than I do. I find that I can do a decent job with this one-on-one, where I'm getting to ask a lot of questions and really get a sense of how someone is modeling something and how they're responding. But as far as the generalizations of different one-on-one learners into a group that we call a developmental level and how to appeal to that developmental level differently than other ones, I don't think that's something that I understand well or I'm great at. I think it's important, which is why I would encourage you having Zach on. I think I can, if I'm not talking to a single person where I'm getting to calibrate, I think I err on the side of assuming people can hold more complexity than they actually can pretty often, and then sharing things that are actually not that useful. So I usually rely on other people who are better at that to help make sure that's being rightly translated.
And Zach is coming back to the Stoa this Thursday. He's going to be guest star with Greg Henriquez, and they're going to have like meta system sex. So maybe you can sneak that question there. All right. I think, who said this one regarding proto-bees? I didn't copy and paste your name. If you can unmute yourself, if you know who you are. Oh, Nathan, that's you. If you can unmute yourself. Okay, I'll read it on your behalf, Nathan. Regarding proto-bees, I've been studying aspects of proto-bee structures that can help transfer over to game B. How can we prevent them from becoming a cult-like structure, us versus them mentality? Would being physically decentralized grouping help prevent some of this uprooting not necessary?
It's a hard topic. I don't know the answer because we haven't had proto-bees that are successful to, like, I don't have enough empirical background on that. In general, if a community wants to prototype a way of living that's very different than the rest of the world, they usually want a certain degree of autonomy from the world to build that culture and not have dominant culture keep pulling it back into other norms. And usually they're doing that because they think that there is some way of being and behaving together that is better than the current social structure. So then it's hard not to have a sense of separation and better than, and maybe even assessment of real. Like, if you assess that current civilization is a self-terminating paperclip maximizer, and most of the aspects of culture are probably part of that, it's very easy to do that thing again where you convert the subjects in it to part of that object structure, and feel dissonance or superiority, or at least a lack of connection. And so to say, well, the goal of having it be able to include everyone, well, that's not enough, because the Crusades had the goal of Christendom being able to include everyone, right? But in a way that didn't really include the actual intelligence of others that might be different. It just included that everybody should think the superior shit that we think. It's almost like there is a certain kind of faith in collective intelligence that is important, where I have a sense that other people who think differently than me, if we can engage in good faith, that I would trust the quality of the output of that dialectic more than I trust myself, because possibly they'll surface things I'm not seeing, right? Like this was almost like the spirit of democracy that was held almost religiously, that there's this idea of a collective intelligence that is trusted, where someone is willing to lean in and do difficult work and make compromises and listen to shit that they don't agree with, in the thought that it has higher potential for good insight and sense making than them or their subgroup that shares the same bias has. And then, I lived in this, I went to this university, undergrad, called Maharishi University. And it was a really funny place. It had maybe the most extreme town gown division that I have witnessed anywhere, because there was this college in the middle of the cornfields of Iowa in this little town called Parsons College, been like an old, beautiful kind of Victorian campus. And there was this kind of Vedic Hindu teacher who wanted to bring meditation over to the West and then actually have it be the basis of a whole educational system. And they were looking for a university, and they got this good deal on Parsons College. So you end up getting this like university of higher education, largely based on Eastern thought, in the middle of the corn and pig fields of Iowa. And so you've got like basically an intersection between physics, consciousness studies, and a Hindu temple, and then, the bunch of farmers. And it was very easy to feel a certain sense of like the better understanding and eliteness of the people in the university environment, and to see the corn farmers as some simpletons. But it was only easy to do that if you didn't interact with them deeply. But then you interact with them deeply and you find out that they actually spend a lot more time on the earth and under the sky and connecting to the plants than the people who are in the university do, and that there's a certain kind of connectedness to nature and wisdom and maybe reliability and integrity that they have that the people in the other place didn't have in the same way. And so I think if the proto-B is connecting with people outside deeply enough to actually stay connected to the humanness of them, so it doesn't go into kind of separatist superiority, that's one helpful thing.
All right. Man, I don't know what question to choose. David Swedlow, if you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks. I'm curious what you're learning from your entitlement inquiry on Facebook. We had a Glassbead game last week, and it came up, and there was a really robust discussion. But I'm curious what you're taking from the comments there, or your thoughts on that.
Premature. I just posted that, I think, 2 days ago, and have only had a chance to read about half the comments and not really sit with and reflect on them. I was actually positively surprised that there were a lot of quite insightful, thoughtful things from different perspectives being shared. It was actually a higher quality collective intelligence input for a Facebook thread than I have experienced on a lot of other questions I've put out there. And so I'm kind of curious as to why that question in particular. Posted a question of, what do you feel entitled to and why? And so of course people got into the semantics of, what does entitlement mean? Are we saying entitled by law, because we all agreed in law, or entitled by a cultural set of norms, or entitled by universe in some kind of absolute sense, or and it is entitled as a court of law would support versus feel entitled. And then there's a big difference between I am entitled to this versus I value this and would work hard to protect it, but don't assume that it is just a given. I think one of the things that a lot of people surface that was valuable is, there are human rights that I really appreciate. There's rule of law that I appreciate, but if I feel entitled to it, and everybody feels entitled to it, and nobody takes the responsibility to maintain it, then it will break down, turn into, tyranny. So it's actually critical to value it and not feel entitled to continue to do the work and maintenance. And so saying I don't feel entitled doesn't mean a kind of nihilism of that we don't want a society that does a better job of rights. It means that we have to bind the responsibility to do the work to ensure that thing. One of the things that I noticed is, I didn't ask the question, what does your behavior demonstrate that you feel entitled to in your day-to-day interactions that you aren't admitting? Like, if you thought more about it. Because a lot of people took it to the macro level of, what do I feel entitled to by the state, or by the market, or by law, or by God, or something like that. But it's interesting how often we just get pissed off at someone else because they didn't do the dishes, or whatever it was, or they didn't tell me the thing, or acknowledge me, and it's very clear I felt entitled to, like, I felt that they were supposed to do that thing, and I got disappointed and upset when they didn't. And so
it was very interesting to see how many people said, I don't feel entitled to anything, which means when they're cognitively reflecting, they acknowledge that that is the like formally true thing. But then to take the next step of, but where are all the places where that actually isn't your experience, and what do you do about that differential? So those first few insights, but I'm actually looking forward to having some more time with it.
Right. Kelly, you are up.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
So thanks. First, I want to thank you, Daniel, and contextualize this through one of your past appearances here, where someone asked you about something you connected with right livelihood. And you basically proposed that we can think of livelihood outside of the context of income and what it is that is what matters to us, and then pursue that. So that kind of like unlocked me to think about what matters to me. And I found a thing that matters to me, and I've been beginning to work on it. For me, that thing is homelessness, and I'm working on contextualizing it. I'm aware, my work is like pointing out what we here probably all know, that it's rooted in these systematic issues like the game A world, right? So all my work in trying to conceptualize it, I'm getting stuck because I can't see the new vision, the new story of homelessness. So my question for you is, what do we do when we know what matters to us and we understand why it matters and like what the barriers are, but we're in need of frame breaking in order to unlock the new problem space, so to speak, if that makes sense?
One thing I try to do is to see if anyone has actually figured key parts of it out that I'm just not aware of. I like to know where the boundary of the best thought is, because I acknowledge that there's a lot of smart people that have spent a lot of time on a lot of these things. And it might not be like common knowledge, but it's knowledge. Then if nobody has worked on something, knowing that is really valuable. And then I say, okay, well, what is the process to get other thoughtful people and kind of work on this thing together and figure it out? But as far as homelessness goes, like, I think the first process that comes to mind for me is I would look at examples of places that don't have homelessness and what they did, right? I would do a positive deviant analysis. Positive deviant on any problem is where you have a distribution and you look for who's doing best with that thing to understand the mechanics in common of that. I would look for any places that have had relatively good homelessness solutions. They had homelessness and now they have much less, consequential homelessness, and see what interventions have worked well. And then similarly, what are the projects that are in process that seem best informed? So, I know of a few on this topic. Mimi Silbert and the Delancey Street Foundation did really good work on reform of drug-addicted violent felons, usually multi-generation drug-addicted violent felons. So they were born into gang families or whatever, and getting them to be able to hold a job and hold a home and stay out of prison. So it was homelessness, but a deeper set of things. And they ended up figuring out some things that worked really quite well and lastingly. I have a friend named Nelson Del Rio that I think has one of the best homelessness solutions that I'm aware of, that uses mostly market solutions, where he can make affordable places where people pay rent is actually rent that is going towards ownership, in a co-op model that goes along with teaching people financial literacy and job literacy and those types of things. So the homeless people go from homeless to having a place to be, to eventually gainfully employed homeowners, and the kind of responsibility of ownership that comes. And he put together a financial model for a real estate play that makes that possible. I think that's probably one of the most promising things. There's obviously the make tiny homes and put them somewhere and put the people in them, and it's cheaper than what it costs to keep putting them in jail. And having them not on the street, not in jail, is probably better. But if it doesn't offer some like developmental direction where they become more self-authoring, then it's still pretty limited. And so the direction where people are not just living on a handout or not just renting, but moving towards a sense of something like ownership, with as long as we're within a frame like capitalism, is quite helpful.
Kelly, looks like you have a follow-up if you want to jump in.
Well, I really appreciate everything you said, and it makes me reconsider if I was like thinking too big, but maybe I want to press you. And my thinking is that all of the things you described, similar to like all the like silly sort of toy ideas I thought of, are still kind of framed in working, which I guess we have to work within the systems that exist. So, but I'm more like curious, and maybe it's just an impossibility, like how do you, like, I want to think of like, or like work with other people to discover like a new vision or like rediscover an old vision. Like, how do we, like, to me, when I see homeless people, I recognize that they are like trapped in a space, and I feel a certain way towards them that I know like other people don't feel. So I want to figure out a way where we don't have to try to do anything to make it so that like homelessness isn't a problem, but so that people have a new sense of what, you know what, I don't know. I might be thinking too big, and maybe I just need to start in a more practical way.
What?
Say again?
You were starting to say that you want people to have a sense of.
So, I think the like ideal solution is that people have a sense that, or maybe I'm just trying to reconnect the dots, but the thought I was going with was like, if you have to create a program to remediate homelessness, then you're not re-envisioning homelessness, you know? If homelessness, if the way that we envision the thing, like the contributors to homelessness were truly changed, then you wouldn't have to try, which I think, so the point that you made about looking where homelessness isn't a problem, I think that's actually a really good idea I didn't think of, but I don't know if that gives you anything more to think about, or if I'm, again, like kind of pushing too hard.
Yeah, so I mean, if you want practical examples, you look at places where there isn't much homelessness or where they've solved homelessness problems, and you see what they did, because then you know it actually works. Maybe their situation doesn't work for all of the situations, but it at least in some context works. Then you need to make sure you understand the context well enough. Was it a country that has a big sovereign wealth fund that was able to afford it and other countries couldn't? Or was it a small country that had a very strong religious homogeneous culture that had a sense of, charity? Like, because if you try to apply something that was unique to a context, outside of that context, you might be missing something, but you can at least start to see some things. There are other ways to reimagine homelessness. So there are some future-oriented projects that don't assume capitalism or don't assume private property ownership of homes or something like that have thought about re-envisioning homelessness, like the Venus Project. Jacques Fresco of the Venus Project was actually very influential for me early on. And he's passed now, but the Venus Project continues, and Peter Joseph is extending some of that work. And so they propose a kind of commons-based cybernetic society in which most property is not based on private property ownership, but generative access. And so you can look at something like that from the point of view of like reimagining at a whole global level. Though, of course, there's a couple questions you have to ask. One is, it's never been implemented and you have no idea if it's actually going to work. And two, you have to ask, in order to get it implemented and to have it work, what does it take? And one of, Peter Thiel's question of, you have an idea that you think is better. There's some people who really don't like that idea. What level of violence do you need to employ to get that idea put in place? And is it still a good idea factoring the amount of violence it takes to make happen, factoring counter pressures? Which is kind of a classic libertarian question, right? Which is, since I'm not God or king and get to just decree it be so, the kind of omniscient question of, well, what can't we all just get along? What's the best way that we could just make it all happen? Well, okay. There's a pretty big gap from Imagine, right? John Lennon singing Imagine, to how the fuck do we build anything here with all the people doing the things with with some people really wanting a Zionist Israeli state, and some people really thinking that that's the great tragedy and the world can't be okay until it's gone, and wanting a caliphate, and some people really believing in social Darwinism and wanting the wealth concentration. And you got to say, okay, so with this world, with these fucking people, right, and these dispositions, how do we move this thing forward? So it's valuable to imagine what it could be, but then the path there ends up being where there's a lot of devils in the details that ends up being very kind of meaningful. So this is why I have much more appreciation for the things like what Nelson Del Rio is doing that can actually take people out of homelessness and actually put them on a path towards more self-authorship in the current world effectively without needing violence. And I'm like, oh, that's actually quite meaningful. Is it, and can it continue to advance itself? Can it develop capacities that can be reinvested to develop more capacities so that it eventually converges? As far as other things where you can think about reimagining homelessness, you can go backwards and look at indigenous cultures where there's some sense, okay, nobody there was homeless. They were all kind of communally cared for. But then you can, then you have to ask, why did that thing stop? And is that commensurate with the ideas of classical liberalism and kind of liberal nation states, which it's obviously not. And so then you say, well, from the nation state liberalism, capitalism point of view, where people are wanting, where there's a system that's wanting to, at least in theory, maximize individual independence and sovereignty and not be controlled by some top-down state that we don't trust or some top-down organization, then that also means people can fuck their lives up. And what responsibility do they have for themselves? And how do you solve the free rider problem of if some other group is then obligated to wealth redistribute? How are they obligated? Is there some physical violence that is going to force them to put their capital there? So these are tricky problems. A lot of people have thought about these things. Maybe you will come up with some very meaningful breakthroughs that nobody has. And I would say if you're willing to dedicate some real earnestness to it, you probably can. And enough people have done enough good thinking, it's probably worth understanding both the success examples and the problem space pretty well. And then there's that saying, the master has failed more times than the average person has tried. For you to make real innovation in the space will require not getting disheartened when almost all of your answers are wrong for a long time.
All right. Christian, you just popped in a question that's interesting. If you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Daniel. My question is, what are the aspects of personal development and personal practice that you've been thinking about the most lately? Also, where do you think, in terms of personal practice and development, we need to pay, generally speaking, the most attention to? Like, where are we lacking the most, and what's getting looked past? And then what are any like recent developments you've seen in these areas, like maybe in terms of new psychotechnologies that are popping up that would be useful for people to explore? Thanks.
I really like the Bildung concept that Thomas Bjorkman has been talking about. Peter, have you had Thomas on? Good. Because it transcends the agency communion or individual and collective divide, which is how do I develop myself as an individual in service to bettering not just my life as an individual, but the collective. So it's personal development of effective citizens, not just effective people. I think those ideas are very often decoupled where there's personal development for, like, most people's vision boards when they're doing personal development is like a dope life for them, and pretty individualistic. And they're doing good to the degree that that makes them feel good, and it's a dope life for them. Or someone is willing to work for the collective at great sacrifice. So they'll go be a soldier, or they'll be a frontline nonprofit activist worker or whatever. But they are developing themselves to a limited point to start to use themselves, and not continuing to develop themselves to be in greater and greater service. So the idea of an ongoing development of self to be ongoingly useful to all other selves, I think it's really important that those two are bound. So that's one thing I would say. And so I really like the Bildung kind of model for that. And then with regard to specific psychotechnologies, so let's kind of categorize them. You've got things like CBT and the Lefko method and Byron Katie's The Work, and basically cognitive models, where you're looking at experiences that had you create a generalized belief or meaning structure, and then working on seeing the effect that that belief or meaning structure overlaid on other environments has that's not effective, and working on changing that belief or meaning structure. And then you've got emotional work like Gestalt and catharsis work, and emotional release and primal screaming, and things that are around where emotion was experienced, and there was kind of physiologic sensation, emotional sensation, and it didn't get to move. How do we actually allow it to move through us and out? And then you've got somatic work, like, is there a way that this is connected to my body? That kind of embodied cognition. The brain is not the only part that has consciousness related to it. So you have trigger point work and Heller work and somatic experiencing and all these things that are working on connecting to emotions in connection to the body and moving them or unwinding them there. And then you have like sensory stuff, like where someone is triggered whenever they hear a loud sound because the gunshot sound that happened in Vietnam, or they're bothered by yellow because that was the color of the room that they were beat in when they were a kid, or whenever they see a man that looks like a certain thing, that there were sensory images that were Pavlovian associated with traumas, and they want to change those sensory conditions that are the triggers. And so you'll see things like NLP techniques that are designed to pull up sensory images, and or some psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, and change the Pavlovian association with those sensory images. I would say that those are not fungible. Those all do different valuable things, and they don't do the same valuable things. And so I'm as far as psychotechnologies, I'm less interested in like, here's a favorite psychotechnology, and more saying it's valuable to be aware of the different spaces and levels in which they act, and the partial value that they each have, and the synergies that can be there between them, so that someone kind of pays attention to working across those spaces. I had experience of going through a particular psychotherapeutic process and going through my whole childhood, all the events linearly, and having healing around all kinds of things. And then going through a different psychotherapeutic process that worked from a totally different angle, going back through the things and having totally different insights that related to increased freedom and happiness and capacity, many times. And I think that's where things like the integral model come in, that are saying, how do we take multiple different valuable things, see which ones are best for us at a given time, and how to not become a fundamentalist to one technique, but to be able to see what actually seems meaningful and useful. So I would say the binding of the development of the individual to their dharma and the contribution to the whole, and the binding of the different parts of self-work to each other, are a couple things that come to mind for me.
So I have a follow-up question with that. So Christian, who just spoke, he's doing something at the Stoa called bespoke psychotechnology, where he shows his own psychotechnology stack and kind of empowers us to figure out how to create our own. And as you know, we have a wisdom gym here at the Stoa where we have reoccurring events like collective presencing, empathy circle. We have a Wim Hof guy comes in three times a week. Bioenergetics is coming. And we're doing like these short research type R&D projects where, like Margaret, the lady who spoke last week, we did Communitas Club where we're investigating all these different intersubjective and conversational modalities. And if they work, we're going to port it in the wisdom gym. We're going to have something like a psychotherapy cafe where we do the same with all these modalities, sovereignty society. And the idea is to have sort of like a robust wisdom gym, maybe like a meta sangha that has all these different kind of practices, and maybe wisdom trainers can kind of guide people and all that. Other than that, I have no idea what I'm doing. But given all that framework I just said, do you think there's any potential there? And what would you say to guide that process?
A couple of thoughts that come up is there's some kind of developmental work that makes shifts that once they've happened, they can't be undone, right? They're really kind of directional shifts. And then there's other kind of work that is really more like exercise. Like you can be very buff and stop exercising and lose it. And it really requires maintenance. And it's valuable to know which is which. Because one of the things that can happen is someone takes a period where they're doing a lot of study or a lot of developmental work. They reach a certain level of clarity and feeling of empowerment where they start saying, okay, now I can go build stuff in the world based on this. But it's some stuff that requires maintenance. They drop the maintenance and they're like taking it for granted and then lose the foundation or capacity. So it's valuable to know what kinds of things are like, oh, I've had that insight and now I can never see it the same way again, versus this is a kind of muscle that has to be ongoingly it might not take as much work to maintain it, just like muscles, as it does to develop them. And then what is an ongoing development routine? I think maintenance is super unsexy for the most part. I think like new shit has its own novelty dopamine hit to it. And in general, like it's more fun to build a house and get to see there's a house and there wasn't a house than it is to like wash the dishes forever. And all I get to show for it is forever that it's the same, as opposed to that it's different in a finite period of time. And yet the house is not very good if I don't do the maintenance stuff, right? And so I think one of the things that's super valuable is to actually culture a very high value around the maintenance. Because otherwise there's a whole lot of take 2 steps forward and then take 2 steps back. And it's all very exciting, and net in 10 years, you actually didn't change your life very much. Versus if I can make a small bit of progress, but maintain it. And this progress I made in my relationships when I was putting a lot of attention there. Now, when I go to put movement in my business, I don't lose the relationship focus because I'm doing the maintenance. Even if I'm only making a small bit of progress in an area at a time, but then I'm maintaining the areas that I developed over the course of a decade, I might have actually moved a lot. So I think actually creating a high value around the maintenance of things that are meaningful and that require it is very helpful. And then another thing, when you're talking about, wisdom gem, is when I shared that there were processes I went through that were very powerful, and then later on, different processes, or sometimes even the same process, just later with more emotional maturity that had whole other layers of insight. I think there's a benefit to settling into that personal growth happens forever. There is not like I'm going to push real hard and get there, and then once I'm there, then I'll be able to do my work in the world. Then I'll be able to have a relationship or be fulfilled. It may be that there is a particular place I want to get to before I move attention to like just not be depressed all of the time, or to feel like I can communicate well enough to have a decent relationship. But I'm still going to be working on my own evolution as a person forever in layers. And so there's a certain kind of settling into that is willing to and takes delight in continuing to put effort in without the impatience of when do I get there. That's that's helpful.
Yeah, what came to mind is like similar to spiritual bypassing. Maybe there's like spiritual distraction where like, oh, I have to, level up before I actually like engage in my dharma in the world. Do you see that as a phenomenon?
Yeah, I remember. I mean, it was so important for me, and it sounds so immature, and it was, but it's usually hard to see ourselves as really immature in the moment because we're looking through the lens that we have. In retrospect, it's usually quite easy. I remember I had this very strong, when I was young, monastic impulse and a very strong romantic, poetic lover impulse, and they were very torn. The monastic impulse was both in terms of like depth of meditation and practice and dharma work that I wanted to do that I thought would be so consuming that I couldn't possibly be a good partner, and I didn't want to be a shitty partner. But I also had this sense that the foundation of the meaningfulness of everything is love, and there's a way in which that expressed itself in an intimate relationship that was so meaningful and wanted to be honored. And this was like a huge source of inner conflict in my early life. And so at one point I had to say, okay, I'm going to give the monastic thing full reign so it stops pulling me out of not being able to be in my relationships fully. So ended a relationship with someone who was really incredible, who I really loved. I was maybe 20, and took a one-way plane ticket to Peru to go off in the jungle by myself, and however long it was going to take to be with myself and do the things that I needed to do. And it was really important that it was a one-way plane ticket, and that I said goodbye to everybody, and that I didn't bind it. And there were a lot of very powerful things that happened. It was very good that I gave myself that. Not everybody needs that at all. I did, because I had a lot of heroes that were monastic when I was young, or something like that. But one of the major things that I saw that brought me out of it was that life had really made this perfect personal development ashram for me, and I was just rejecting it because I had this idea that I was supposed to do this monastic thing. And I'm like, actually, when I was in relationship and when I was in work, I was getting confronted by my triggers all the goddamn time, which were my own lack of wholeness, which is exactly what I needed to work on. But rather than embrace that as my development, I had some idea of, no, spiritual looks like this other thing, and I need to go do this. And I'm like, actually, it's kind of easier to not be triggered out here. And it's also kind of meaningless. And there's certain kinds of growth that I just can't get out here. And there was a deeper embracing of kind of all of life as a developmental path, rather than them being separate. So, yeah.
I was gonna like mention like the monastery is your world type thing, or the world's your monastery, and then each thing is a forcing function to improve and develop. I want to sneak in another question in regards to the wisdom gym. Margaret and I were kind of like, we're collecting all these different practices, and we're thinking of having like multiple taxonomies or meta systems to kind of organize them, and for the psychology of practice that might form in the wisdom gym. Do you have any you personally use, or any recommend, maybe descriptive like meta systems or frameworks, maybe like Ken Wilber's like growing up, showing up, cleaning up, and ones that might like systems that might help negotiate what practices to do at any given time?
Yeah, I think the wake up, grow up, show up, clean up model is a nice model. I found that this specific type of methodology matters less than someone's connection to the therapist if they're working with someone. If your therapist says they're doing Gestalt or CBT or Jungian work, they're really just a person that has a lot of experience. And if you feel like they have an embodied wisdom around things you're working on and you feel like they grok you, then what happens there will be beyond whatever the method that they claim they primarily do is. So as far as working with somebody goes, I think the feeling of right connection is pretty important, more important than a model idea of appropriate method. And then one person that you're working with might be relevant for a while until whatever that is completes, and then something else is. You just have to be careful when you feel a sense of completion. Is it actually completion? Or is it now we're getting to the stuff where they're pushing on something I really don't want to see, and so I'm trying to get rid of them. So, you know, that's just the depth of earnestness in our own inquiry. And similar to that, I would say one can have a model of, okay, well, I did this lectical assessment on myself and I'm in this level of complexity of development. Therefore, these types of models are the most appropriate meditation or psychotherapeutic process, so I'll do it. I'm not saying those considerations are worthless, but paying attention to what your experience in a different practice is and doing the ones you feel called to is also pretty important. I think if you're doing a practice and it doesn't feel resonant, it doesn't feel like anything's moving, you can give it, if you've heard really good things about it, you can give it good faith attempt for a long enough time to see if it clicks. But you're also going to get more movement out of something that you do because you feel resonance with it. So I'm saying I wouldn't try to formalize it too much.
Right. Yeah, that's been my intuition as well. And
sometimes it's actually critical to pay attention to something that is experientially meaningful that you don't cognitively understand, and where it's actually critical to not cognitively understand it. Somebody does a session with you with crystals or chakras and it's like actually profound, and you notice that you're not triggered by shit anymore. And you're like, but I don't necessarily believe in crystals. You don't like, it's easy to say, okay, well, for crystals to work, it either means that it's a placebo or it means that it's some electromagnetic effect based on the crystalline structure of the molecules in the lattice. Well, maybe not. Maybe it's a whole other set of shit that's in your unknown set that you can't conceive of properly. So it's okay to say, I don't necessarily believe in a specific proposition of how crystals work, but I believe in a meaningfulness of my experience that I'm letting myself have. And so I don't have to become a proselyte of a specific way of describing it that doesn't make sense to me. But because it doesn't make sense to me, I also don't have to reject the experience. Sometimes it's important to let yourself have an experience that feels meaningful, and you'll understand it progressively more later.
I like that a lot. Someone, Joe said in the chats, you don't get to choose what ends up working. All right, so let's sneak in one more question before the hour. Hannah, you had a question.
I do. Thank you for choosing me. So I would very much like to start bringing some of the tools that I'm learning here to some of my other communities and relationships. And so I'm wondering, what skills can I work on interpersonally, intrapersonally to start facilitating or moving towards meaningful conversations between tribes?
So something else, a meta thing I'll comment here is, this whole format is just weird. This format we're doing, I appreciate it. I think I hope that people feel that there is some value in it. It was an experiment for me. I know it was for Peter. I didn't feel like saying yes to Sensemaker in residence to speak on some topic I've spoken on a bunch of times somewhere else. But it felt like, since this was live and it was a community of engaged people, and interested in the intersection of personal growth with meaningful topics in the world, a chance to like just talk about what's alive more on the personal growth side would be interesting. But the like one-to-many structure is strange because there's plenty of people on the call who have wisdom on these topics that I don't have, and yet we have an hour here together, whatever it is. I'm glad that there are many other people that are contributing to this place. And I imagine, I hope that you guys have people like Diane Hamilton and Zach and maybe Vervaeke and other people that have worked with people for a long time, have a lot of depth of experience, that are part of an advisory council that is ongoingly contributing. I imagine that's the case. But normally, if I was having a conversation with anybody here one-on-one, I wouldn't answer questions. Typically, like with the question, Hannah, you just asked me, the first thing I would do is ask you back, well, what is your sense on that? What are you working on? Where do you find that you have limitations in that currently? And yet that doesn't scale to being able to talk to when there's hundreds of people and trying to say what about this question might be relevant to everybody. So just even as a meta point, a question straight to an answer is usually not the best method of either learning or healing, but it's the nature of the format. If you're interested in actually facilitating, I would say pay attention to which methods you're going deepest with and getting the most benefit from, and actually see if they have programs where you can learn how to be a facilitator. Many people learn at a certain point in their life how to be a therapist of a particular kind, not because it's their dharma to do therapy forever, but because they're deepening their own knowledge and practice of it. And oftentimes, if there's a pattern that's really deep for you and you work with a lot of other people who have it, and seeing clearly and objectively the way it shows up in them, you get deeper and deeper insights into it. So yeah, you might actually decide to take practitioner training. And then as far as bringing it to different communities and what skills you would develop other than just the practitioner ones, the ability to translate reality tunnels or translate ontologies can be very interesting. Now, it's this a kind of like cognitive philosophic thing that is not necessarily always relevant, but if you're wanting to bring some experiential phenomenological thing to a rationalist community that maybe doesn't even have ontic entities for those things, right? Like then being able to translate it in a way that can relate to something they do have a relationship to, and then kind of on board just the willingness to explore. That can be very helpful. And so this is like the skills I would say are twofold. One is the ability to say, okay, well, what is this kind of ontologic worldview? What is this one? And how would I translate them? And that's kind of like a communication clarity process. The other is an empathy process of being able to see what are the people here actually interested in, and what are they open to, and how do I connect there? I don't know if that answers at all what you were asking.
Would you like to follow up, Hannah?
I don't think it does answer it, but I think you've stated why and some methods for moving forwards anyways. And I am satisfied by that.
Fair enough. And I believe that is the time here, right, Peter?
Yep. We're gonna land the plane now. Any closing thoughts for us, Daniel? I'm also curious, maybe it's something you can mention later, but anything you're interested about this community in particular, these sessions, that might inspire some questions for us for next time.
Yeah, I think I'm particularly interested in the people who are called to reimagine the future, whether it's the future of homelessness or agriculture or economics or law or whatever it is, or all of them together, you know, game B, some kind of new world. the people who really care about that and want to think about it and work on it and find a community of other people who do, and who recognize that not just their cognitive learning, but their development in other ways is part of that, because they want to already become citizens of that world, right? They want to notice the non-game be resonant things in themselves, having been conditioned in this world, and work to like become inhabitants of that world so they can sense it better and help bring it about. I think that's a necessary and particularly beautiful intersection. And so what I was interested in here is people who are considering the big picture and considering some of the difficulties of how do we transition with multipolar traps and with whatever. And then what happens in me that decreases my capacity to be effective with that, or that could increase my capacity. The intersection of the like, what do I work on in myself to increase my effectiveness in my being of service to this larger thing that we're all here on? How do we address the meta crisis? I think that is what I'm most interested in with this community, what I'm most hopeful about. And specifically, more questions in that vein would be what I'd be interested in addressing in our last time speaking together.
Great. So I'll probably send out a survey with that frame. We'll get some questions in for your last session. So Daniel, thanks so much for coming to the Stoa once again. We'll see you next week. I will make some closing announcements, but first let's tag in Tyson, because right after this, we're going to stay on the same link, and there's going to be Rap Unbattles. That's going to be led by Tyson Flows. So Tyson, if you can kind of unmute yourself and plug that.
Sure. Thank you. Yes. In this same room, we are going to be engaging in the third version of Rap Unbattles, which is a new experiment here at the Stoa where we repurpose freestyle rap and the concept of rap battling. But instead of trying to like make our point, prove ourselves right, win over the other person, we take freestyle rap and use it as a way to engage in inquiry together, practice good faith dialectic, and ultimately build communitas. So I've really been enjoying it, and I look forward to seeing you here very soon.
Awesome. And after I make some closing announcements, we'll just take a quick bio break, and then we'll take Tyson in. We had tons of events tomorrow, tons meaning 4. One of them is Entrepreneurialism as a Spiritual Practice with Derek Sievers. He's the guy that I think created CD Baby. He's a popular entrepreneur that does blogging. So that's 7 p.m. Eastern time. That's going to be a really fun talk. And I think it's whatever October 22nd is. The first series of high pitch conversations in a new key. So all the ladies of the Stoa are going to have a really epic conversation. Benita Roy, Nora Bateson, Raya Beck, Maria Martineau, and many more. They're going to just have a conversation, then we're going to have a collective conversation. So that's going to be very exciting. Yeah, it says 12 p.m. on October 22nd. You can RSVP on the website. We have a Patreon, and you can sign up for the mailing list. So that being said, thank you, everyone. If you want to leave right now, you can leave right now. If you want to hang out a bit, just check it out. You can do that as well. So again, thanks for coming to the Stoa today.